This is Learning to Dad.
I'm the cool dad. That's my thing.
With Tyler Ross.
But what I do have are a very particular set of skills.
I'm going to have fun, and you're going to have fun.
All right, we are on. Hello and welcome to Learning to Dad with Tyler Ross. That's me, I'm Tyler. And I've got an awesome episode today that I'm psyched to talk with Michael Shea, a psychotherapist and a friend. And it's just, we usually have this different story arc, but this is going to be such a unique conversation. Thank you for joining me, Michael.
Thank you for having me. This is going to be awesome.
Yeah, it's just good to see you. I'm sorry we didn't get to hang out in person, but I'm glad that everybody's going to get to see you and see us. Talk.
Feel our synergy, right?
Yeah. Talk a little bit about what, not like who you are, but what you do and the things that you do to help people.
Sure. So I do integrative psychotherapy, which is taking a look at the whole person, not just the issue that people bring in, but also the whole person in terms of their strengths and also what's going on biologically, what might be going on, even spiritually. People want to speak about that. And a lot of what I do is bring it from the strengths-based perspective. So people come in a lot of times identifying a problem, but there are areas in their life that they have a lot of resilience and resources that they use to deal with challenges. It's just how can that be applied to the emotional state and dealing like with psychological issues. And that's the precipice upon which I like to help people begin to trust themselves and as well find a path to deal with some of the stress and conflict that they're presenting when they come in and see me. That's a little bit about what I do. The other thing is I do a lot of work with the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. And the center works to deal with trauma around the world. And in the United States, for instance, we've been doing work with school shootings, in Parkland. We've done work with the VA. But we work to help people understand that trauma is something that can be healed from by being willing to deal with exercises that help calm down the mind and the brain and the body in order to be more in a mindful or what we call a choiceful state rather than being reactive and triggered. It's a little bit about what I do.
I can only imagine the trauma associated with, a school shooting or some other event like that. But just I would think that kind of expertise could be applied to anyone because we've got so many inputs and so many, just things raining on us all the time. To get to like normal seems like a challenge.
Do you think it's a constant stress, don't you? Responsibility in our modern day world, right?
It's true. We've democratized opportunity in a big way, but we've also, made it, it's hard to focus, it seems like.
Exactly. And I think that's a great point to really hone in on, particularly about being a dad, is how much responsibility and focus it takes because of the various roles that fathers play. They're their individual selves, they're a spouse, they're a parent, and there's a lot of management in all of that. And I think that stress is something that, particularly the fact that you're doing this podcast, is a great forum to start helping people cope with some of these stressors and responsibilities more effectively.
Thank you. That's definitely my hope and part of the goal, and certainly going to be a focus of our conversation. I've talked to mostly just dads about, that are entrepreneurs, professionals, trying to balance all those things. And we're just amongst us talking amongst ourselves. So having like an expert perspective to share is really awesome. So grateful for your time and willingness to come on here.
No, my pleasure.
Yeah. So what is there any kind of profile of a person that you often find coming to you dealing with this type of stuff?
Sure. Well, there's a couple of things I think that might be important to talk a little bit about as I talk about the profile. So one of the things I pay attention to are trends that change over time. And one of the things that has changed over time is the constellation of being a family. And so let me the industrial age, fathers really weren't involved in as much parenting responsibilities because mothers sort of were primarily the homemaker. I think since women have entered the workforce and in a good way, and I think as a result of that and our definition of what it means to be masculine is evolving because of women's rights issues. I think there's been this sort of identity. Who am I as a dad? What does it mean for me to be male? How do I express my masculinity without it being the new buzzword is toxically masculine? How do I do that in a way that is good modeling for children? And I think for us to think of children not just as biological, but all of us as men are witnesses and examples to children. So with that, what I am seeing people coming in, and particularly men, they're dealing with issues of how can I be an effective father in a way that I can attend to my responsibilities in terms of providing, or even in some instances being the homemaker. But how can I do that in a way where I don't feel overwhelmed and my stress doesn't get imparted onto my children? And I set an example that's either misinformed or not the best example. And that's a lot of the stress that I've been dealing with fathers. It's been fascinating for me, particularly because what's been happening around fathers as they become fathers of teenagers, there's another sort of stress point just because of the developmental issue. So there's a spectrum of things that I'm seeing with people come in to talk about parenting issues and being a father and what's that responsibility and how can I be emotionally engaged with my child and yet still be somebody who engages in my behavior, which involves being structured, responsible, and a good example.
So you touched on something that kind of was close to me, the use of the word masculine versus being a male and being masculine, and how those things kind of have, I guess, evolved. Like, what are some of the observations and trends that you've seen in terms of what masculine means?
That's a great question. And so here's what I pay attention to. Early on in my undergraduate program, I was undergraduate in psychology and philosophy, specifically with an emphasis in women's studies. Now, why in the 80s would a man go into a women's studies program? Primarily, I went into it because I grew up in a home where feminism was just introduced. I didn't know what that meant. I certainly knew that there was a shift happening in my own personal experience. And what I noticed was what the feminist movement was trying to do is help us understand that every human being is made up of masculine and feminine, regardless of our gender. We're all made up of that. Mm-hmm. But I think what we've done is we've limited masculine expression to the gender of male and feminine expression to the gender female. That's not how it works. And the psyche doesn't work that way. And all we have to do is look at some of the work of Carl Jung, who talks about this in the anima and animus, which is basically masculine and feminine. But today we're in a new age because of the women's movement, where it's okay for us to feel and express our feelings and be more emotionally connected. But that was not a lexicon or a belief system that a lot of people endorse. I mean, you and I, in some ways, are really the advantages of that. So I think masculine, if we look at it from a more psychological, masculine, let's talk about it psychologically, biologically. Masculine would be associated with the left side of the brain, which is more logical, more moving into having things as a process in a linear way, being more productive and generative in terms of behaviors and creating things in terms of work product, ideas that manifest in financial ways or in practical ways. So masculine is really being able to take an idea and a feeling and express it both verbally, writtenly, and in communication versus reflecting on it. Reflection is more a feminine trait.
Interesting.
And so part of what I often say to people is, how do you make room, men particularly, how do you make room for the feminine aspects of yourself? And a lot of them sort of throw their head back and they're like, well, I'm male. And having the educational process to say to them, look, yes, you are male, but masculinity and femininity are not genders.
Yeah.
And having that conversation. Some men are more geared to, internally to be connected to what we would call more feminine attributes, which would be much more associative, creative, intuitive, more engaged in processes that are involved comprehensive, open-minded thinking. Things don't have a process in terms of 1, 2, 3. They might go like a pinball machine. They might go from 1 to 4 to 3. So there's sort of a more circular process.
And I can see that being a huge gap for people that really identify themselves as male masculine, even though that's not necessarily, and like just a communication gap between genders as a result of having feminine and masculine traits. Do you see a lot of just having to, spouses and even like parents from like a gender level having to accept that feminine doesn't mean that you're anything other than just a description of traits, and that sometimes it's as simple as understanding that?
Exactly. It takes a while, and I think we're still in an evolutionary period of sort of how do we assimilate this understanding of masculine and feminine. I think we're seeing this in all sorts of ways, whether it's related to sexuality or it's related to one's identification. I think that's a manifestation of how we're trying to assimilate a set of internal realities that, previously, I think prior to the, women's movement, we sort of just kept those to gender specific. Those traits were very much male, masculine, female, feminine. And we've evolved past that point. And I think in a way that's really, research is showing, the American Psychiatric Association even published an article about this, that the bonding that's happening today with fathers, it makes a difference with their children. They're less likely to be divorced. They're less likely to act out. They're less likely to be involved in drugs, because the father interaction on an emotional level has a different set of receptors activated than if a mother does it. And that's biological.
So for any dads that might be listening to this who, unbeknownst to them, are not embracing their feminine traits, which therefore is like creating an obstacle for their relationships, is there like a checkbox, like to use an overly masculine, like a 21-point inspection that like we could kind of self-assess?
See, you just combined both of them. You thought in a very masculine way in order to incorporate the feminine aspect. See, you already get it. Love that. So so one of the things we do, and this is why I like the curriculum and the work we do with the Center for Mind-Body Medicine. What happens, for instance, when, let's say, for instance, today you took 5 minutes to unhook from your day, and you decided to do a breathing exercise, just inhaling 6 times, in and out. Inhale, exhale 6 times. What you begin to do biologically is you begin get in touch with literally the two parts of the brain that are considered masculine and feminine, and you get them together. And that inhalation of 6 times, you actually program your brain to sort of, okay, let's work both sides together. Well, when that begins to happen, we become not only open to our thoughts, which tend to be more a masculine association, but we get connected to our feelings. That's where I think we are in a learning curve as men. How do we deal with feelings? Many times they're not convenient. We don't get a calendar invite time to deal with feelings. No.
Right. Our reception has gone.
Sometimes they feel...
Oh, we lost reception there right after a calendar invite.
Okay. You ready to go?
Ready.
Okay. So, basically what I'm saying is, since they're uncomfortable, they're not convenient, part of what this exercise does is it helps to connect the dots between the two. And people begin to see that rather than their emotions and their thoughts being separate, they're actually, just through this inhalation, they become aware of sensation. So one thing I say to people is practice, particularly men, practice breathing 6 times. Inhale through the nose, exhale through the mouth 6 times, multiple times a day, to check in with yourself about what's going on. Is there worry? What's one of the number one things, if we were to talk about men worry about? Money.
Yeah.
Do I have enough to take care of XYZ PDQ?
Mm-hmm.
So how much does somebody spend their time worrying about money? That would be an important, by being that self-reflective, suddenly what we're doing is we're stopping, is what I call slow down. We're thinking, we're being open, and we're being perceptive, like a stop sign. Slow down, think, be open, and perceive. Notice. That practice, if you did that with your child, just think of what happens when a child begins to slow down, think, be open to what's in their heart, and perceive. Usually, they say pretty insightful things.
That's. I don't know if anybody listening caught that. That's STOP. Slow down, think, be open, and perceive. That's wonderful. So it's of the 30 plus interviews I've done, I always ask the question, what's your greatest hope for your kid? And male, female, 9 out of 10 always say, I want them to be happy. And I think happiness is a feeling. So to think that a father might not be open to their own happiness or feeling, but that's their ultimate goal for their kid. It seems like a disconnect that, everybody, both of you can be happy.
Right, exactly. And what I like about that, Tyler, that question is a hope, a wish, and maybe even a dream that might be predicated on other variables, but the emotional content is, I really want to see my child experience joy. That's a loving act. It's an act of love.
Yeah. Does that feel like a feminine act? Is that a dad embracing the feminine and the hope for their child?
Right. It's an act of love. And I think it's an act of love that in many ways, more sociologically, we're used to a mother saying that to her child. What a lovely thing for a father to be able to say that as well.
Yeah, I've mostly talked to people kind of my age. I've talked to some folks that have kids that are my age, and of course, my own family experience. The difference in the willingness to talk about how you feel is incredible. And I don't know if it's because that's the type of person that's attracted to talking with me on this podcast, or if it's a generational thing. Are you seeing a trend line in men embracing their more feminine attributes?
I am, So, for instance, let's talk about that trend line. Having worked with some vets and people who've been served our country, many instances that that paradigm of being in the military is not endorsing of their emotional state, and yet they're still having emotions. So part of what I've noticed is what we have to pay attention to is today, it's a norm for us to say to our young men and, hey, deal with your feelings. But what about the generations that haven't had that?
Yeah.
Haven't had that, process and endorsement? That's where I think the gap has been. And I think the close of that gap actually has been the younger generation modeling to the older generation. We don't have to live this way anymore. Because here, let's just deal with this just from a biological level. When we have an emotion, before we're aware of it on a mental level, our body, our brain has already processed those biochemicals. It's already happening.
Yeah.
You can't stop an emotion from happening. It's happening biochemically. We just are aware of it, usually through a body of sensation, like my stomach's tight, or I'm holding my breath, or I'm clenching my teeth. That's sort of, or we're sort of obsessive in our mind. What I like about what we're doing today in our modeling of men is saying, look, let's make a place to identify our emotions, express them respectfully for ourselves and our own well-being and the well-being of the people that we're connected to, and then move on. And I think that formula has been a formula that many older people and people in systems like the vets are beginning to see has offered them a freedom, and that I'm not separated from this emotions. It's not something, this crazy thing going on inside. Actually, it's a part of who I am that gives me information so I can make good decisions.
There's so many things going through my mind. Embracing the feminine, embracing our emotions and processing them, not suppressing them, doing whatever you have to do with them and letting them go. It just seems like it's easy for us to think that this is all for us, just for our own benefit, but it's for the benefit of the people that we have relationships with. And like we are modeling after our parents and their generation, our kids are going to do the same thing. So like anybody who's listening now who might be embracing their overly masculine side, saying, nah, I don't need to do all this horse shit. I'll just push it down and have a beer like a real man does. Like you're not, it's my perception that is not to the benefit of your children and not to the benefit of your relationship with your wife or partner or the children's parents or anything.
Great. I'm thinking, and this, your statements brought up. So my dad died in November of last year, and one of the things, he was a vet, died at 89. He ran a football officiating association for years. Worked specifically in sports, and one of the things, as he was getting ready to transition, he said to me that he was grateful that even though it was so tense growing up because of my mother's feminism, that was not how he understood the world, that he was grateful that that tension forced him to start to deal with his emotions, even though he didn't do it well at first. And I think in many ways there is a learning curve. But he said what it did was it afforded him the opportunity to feel connected more to us, my sisters and I. And that left an impression on me because it said, look, here was somebody who very much was fixed in a point of view. And even though he didn't like how he was challenged, that challenge afforded him an opportunity for growth. So I often say to people who are very wedded to the social scripting, it's not that you have to change in the moment. Being open to it and to that opportunity to be open to it, to experience your emotions not as a negative, and to experience connecting. Look at our contemporary term. To have a bromance actually can be a rewarding and an enlivening and supportive thing, that as much as we can get that from women, we can also get that from one another.
I think that's awesome. One thought just replaced another, but I want to talk just when you said bromance, I think about a couple of my guy friends that whenever we hang up the phone, it's, I love you, and it's not like, love you, bro. It's like, no, seriously, I love you. You're important to me. And it's, these are the same guys that you do all those, quote unquote man things with. And I'm very grateful and fortunate to have people like that in my life that are open to having those kinds of conversations. I'll see if that other thought re-enters my mind, because I felt like it played well with the segue.
It'll come back to you.
Yeah. Relationships, talking, being open. Oh, yes. Do you have any, I'm sure you've met and worked with people that are pretty solid in their point of view, that they're rigid and trying to, do you have any kind of practical advice of an exercise somebody can do, like the breathing, that, as a first step towards, saying it's okay to have feelings and share them and talk about them?
Well, to build on the breathing exercise, I often ask people to start, particularly men, to start when they breathe. What do you notice in your body? So, for example, doing this, do they notice their extremities are cold, like their hands or feet? Do they notice their stomach is tense? Do they notice that their heart is racing? And then what I try to do is say, if you were to put an emotion, a one-word emotion to that physical experience, even if you are guessing, what do you think it would be? What it does is it begins to get people to speak, quote unquote, the language of emotions, which sounds jargony. I'm a therapist, so a lot of people, we can sound very emotionally jargony. but it does, because it's important, because when we identify it, even if we identify it to ourselves, what we do is we take it out of just leaving it in the body. Because a lot of times when our emotions stay in the body, they affect everything from our cell development to how we digest to how we sleep. Stress. Stress is a lot of times unexpressed emotion.
I'm 1,000% a guinea pig for that. I've been seeing a great doctor that has encouraged me to just kind of move around, be aware. And the more, every now and again, I'll come into a movement, I'll move my arm or shoulder or hip, and I'll suddenly feel myself not breathing. And that point, whether it's purely physical or associated with stress or emotion, I don't know what it means, but I know it means something. And that's feedback. And I think, the general awareness to capture that is a huge step for me. So I just, that has been great for me. The other thing I would offer is I say to a lot of men who get very fixed in sort of, this is who I am. I often say, let's utilize the mind and the imagination. So, and what I start to do is ask them, what do you wish for? What do you dream? What do you desire? What makes you excited? What makes you passionate? Those questions, a lot of times, men don't get asked those. Yeah. We often associate those attributes to somebody who's more creative and more feminine. I think those kinds of questions are important, because what they do is they talk about our aspirations and our desires in a way that they need to be recognized, not always acted on, but recognized. And I think that's another thing I like to do, is ask people, what are your desires? What are your passions? What are your dreams, wishes? They may evolve, but we all have them. And to piggyback on that a little bit, I love lists, to-do lists and goal lists, and visualizing people. I'm not that guy, but some people put up the car that they want or the vacation they want to take in pictures. Right. So that's, I guess, an interesting way to exercise the wish, the hope, the goal.
The visualizations, that's another great exercise I invite people to do. Yeah. And I even with to piggyback on the question you said that you ask in every podcast, what do you wish for your children? I ask that question to people. What if you had a dream come true about what you would like for your child, what would that be? Sometimes people go to the answer that you often get and most significantly get, which is I want my children to be happy. But there are some parents, and particularly fathers, who can articulate, I really have a vision of my son or daughter being X or Y. And then what we have to take a look at is, does that match your child's nature?
Great topic of conversation. I said to somebody recently, the way my parents grew up was, you're going to be a lawyer, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a nurse. Done. Parenting over. So can you elaborate on what's good for you and what you think is good for your kid and all those things?
So the key word that I used is nature. So for instance, what does that mean? Well, our nature is attributed to the characteristics that we would use to describe ourselves, our values, our skill sets, our attributes, and even the places where we might have growing edges. That sort of gives us the compilation of those things give us an understanding of what someone's nature is. So let me use a personal example. My father was wedded to me being a football player. I'm 5'7", and since I've been in 10th grade, I've weighed 140 pounds. I'm 54 today. That's not going to work. I was a swimmer, and I swam from the age of 5 year-round until I was 18. But that kind of hope and dream for me to be a football player, I mean, that's a wish, but it's not consistent with my nature, my physical nature, and also what I was drawn to. But how does a parent deal with that? Does that feel like a loss? Does that feel like a rejection? Is the child being defiant? Is this an authority issue? I think part of the way to deal with that is we can see it most in where our children succeed and where they find joy and what's consistent with their nature, and taking a look at the nature and the different components that I spoke about. And, sometimes what we wish for our kids is not their reality. And letting go of that and accepting them as their nature is really a gift. It's an act of love.
And I think it's hard. So a piece of advice that I've received was, sometimes you take action and sometimes your action is to just get out of the way and let your kids be themselves. But what is there a symptom to a relationship that has, a parent, a father or mother kind of trying to impose their dreams on their kid?
Well, I mean, if we could call it a symptom, we could use common language today that's being used, everything from a helicopter parent, we could call it that, and that's one vernacular that's used. But this, that symptom is really demonstrating an issue around being wedded to control. Mm-hmm. And that's the thing that I think we find out as parents. In the end, the only control we have, how to be good role models, how to provide good values for our children. Learning to listen is a very good one. Being loving even when it's difficult. Always reassuring a child that no matter what happens, I will still be here and love you. And those attributes, those action steps really help deal with sometimes the fact that our children might make different choices than we would wish for them. Sometimes it's reality.
Yeah. I could feel like I could stay on this topic, but there's a lot of stuff that we talked about yesterday that I'd love to try to jam into the time that we have together. Sure. Some of my notes that I wrote down from yesterday were, with social media, men having male friends, the realities of being a man today, addiction for, parents and kids? Is it anything jump out at you that you kind of want to run with?
Well, let's start with addiction, because it is one of the number one issues we're dealing with. First of all, I think it's a fallacy for us to believe today that none of us self-medicate. Mm-hmm. All of us do.
Yeah.
And whether that becomes addiction or not is not the issue. All of us want to self-soothe. The body is built to experience pleasure. It's built to restore itself. We want to do anything to not experience pain or to troubleshoot immediately, which is a masculine attribute. How can I not be in this pain quickly? So I think when we talk about addiction, we need to talk about it in terms of we're in particularly in Western culture, a time period where self-medication is a norm and self-soothing is a norm. When does self-medicating and self-soothing become addiction? And that's the part that we have to start to pay attention to. Is it affecting our functionality, our connection to our families? Is it affecting our work? How about physically? Those begin to become the markers of addiction. But I think when we know all of us have a propensity to be self-medicating, monitoring that's very important, and particularly for parents. Because when, for example, let's use one example I spoke about not long ago in a seminar I gave around parenting. Saturday nights. Usually Saturday nights, people like to hang out, maybe go out if their kids have a sitter or, there's a sort of a date night sometimes. And you're getting ready and these kids watch, their parents get ready, they go out, and then they come back and they're inebriated, they're drunk. They're a little, overserved. That sends a message when kids see them. And the message that it sends is, it's okay for me to be out of control, and it's okay for me to have a good time, even if that good time and being out of control might put me in harm's way. And there's a message that's unconscious that we have to be careful of. We don't want to send that message to our children because they will repeat what they see. So it's important to be attuned around like substances, behaviors, money, food, alcohol, drugs, sex. Important to be attentive. How do I utilize those pleasure experiences and not misuse them, abuse them, or use them as a crutch? That was the one that
the observations that kids make and take in. I mean, people say it 100 times. They watch everything, they see everything, but I cannot attest to that more. It's so true. The most modest of things gets noticed. So it's a consistent topic of conversation among my friends. Any parents listening that don't believe that, you're wrong, and you need to be aware that your kid knows. They see it and they're formulating opinions based on it. So self-medication, we all do it. And you talked about a lot of different things, but can we put some of those on the nose, that some of the listeners that are self-medicating to the point where they're like really being unhealthy to themselves or their relationships, like, could you call out some of the most common on the nose self-medication techniques?
Sure. So, like I said, alcohol and food is a self-medicator. What I often say to people, let's stick with those two right now, is if you're noticing the following: I am not as focused. My physical body is out of balance. I am not sleeping well. I'm not engaged at home with my family members. I'm doing the activity of the alcohol or the substance instead of talking about. Those are markers to pay attention to. and to sort of do a checklist. People can go online and look at addiction checklists and do a self-assessment. And then if the self-assessment indicates it, I think one free option is always 12-step programs. That's free. You can go just sit and listen. You can do anything. The second option is you could go and call a professional and say, hey, look, I think I'm self-observing that I'm concerned about this. I want some help and do a check and balance to make sure I don't impose this on my kids.
And I would suggest that is a real testament to strength, that someone would take themselves out of their pattern or rut and just even to explore, to observe other people. I've definitely self-medicated. And I want to talk about engagement with kids too, because I've definitely been the guy that says, no, I totally engage with my kids. I'm there, but I'm not there. So I can feel a difference everywhere when I'm truly engaged, making eye contact, interacting. Can you talk a little bit about engagement and what people think it is and what it might actually be?
Well, I love how you started, because I think you started. Eye contact's the number one thing, particularly with a child. So let's sort of think about it this way. When we're in a room with a child, and we may not be interacting, they're still hearing everything. They're receiving. They're always sort of like they're like little cameras. They're downloading all the information. Okay. So, but when we talk directly to them, we look into their eyes, we say to them, hey, look at me, I want to say something to you. There is an immediate response and an engagement that we know, even if it's uncomfortable, we're having a moment, it's important. Getting down, if they're younger kids, at their level rather than speaking up is very important, because it gives them a sense that we're at the same level. I often say to people, if engaging with your kids involves also working on your device, you're not engaging.
Yeah.
And on that note, I think I often say that the number one way to communicate with our children on devices is only for purposes of logistics. If we communicate how we feel about a situation through our devices, we're missing out on the engagement being live. Unless there's a conflict and it's too much to deal with it at the time, take a break and come back to it, take a time out and regroup and make a decision how to have the conversation that's difficult in conflict, with the intention of saying to a child, look, no matter what, we're going to get through this, because that's what we do as family. We get through this, we support one. I think using words that oftentimes we have in our head and we think, well, people know that already. You think of how when you say at the end of your conversation, I love you. People don't know that unless we use our words. And it's another thing that is very much a value that kids need, particularly from their fathers. They need to hear what they think. So those are some immediate thoughts.
Yeah, that's the speaking what's in your mind. I am definitely trying to be better at that, particularly with Sarah, my wife. Every time I think she looks pretty, I probably only say it once out every 10 when I don't think she could hear it enough. So I'd encourage, spouses to be more vocal, especially if that's, a language they receive information in, particularly.
Use them words.
Use them words.
Use them words.
Use them words, man. Sound like you're in Fauquier and not in D.C. In engagement, I felt like I wanted to talk more about that. Let's talk about communication and engagement. And I see, my sisters are in their 20s, or 19 and 22. I forget exactly. Sorry, guys. But I feel like people in their generation will have really heartfelt conversations over text. And of course, the other end of that spectrum is, what the opposite of heartfelt is, butt hurt conversations It's like they're being mean to each other in the same way, and like they're not watching people's expressions change. I don't know how you get a kid to not engage in that, to not try to, manage problems or manage relationships via the written word in 280 characters or less.
So, I like how you're framing this, because in a way, our words do matter. And yet we also need to keep custody of our words. So think of it this way. Our words are vessels that can either help, they could give information, they can also hurt, in addition to the tone and the timing. And I find that when I say to people, use your words with intention and also with the support of staying connected. If we use our words to do a one-upmanship, or we use our words to hurt somebody, we're not staying connected to that person. We're not engaging in how we could, as a unit, potentially help one another, support one another, and even help one another grow. So I find it's important for people in communication to be thoughtful of what we say to one another. Now, to go back to your example of these, long texts, in some ways, that's a great way to have a communication pattern. The problem with that way is there's something that we miss out on a biological level when we communicate directly person to person. There's a research that was done about whether or not automation versus actual human interaction made a difference. And actually, customer service demonstrates that personal interaction makes a difference. So we apply that to just young adults talking to one another vis-a-vis text in a long, heartfelt conversation. Think of how much richer that conversation would be if they were in person. Now, it might feel more vulnerable, maybe more intimate, a little bit more uncomfortable. But actually, on a biological level, it's better for us because we're present in a way that's not removed, and we're having to be more of intention, because in the moment, we're going to see how the other person responds. And that makes a difference. It helps.
Truly. And that sitting behind that mask of not having that biological or chemical reaction, I see on the other side too, if somebody talk about masks, exactly, these riots and protesters and things, I don't think half that violence happens if these guys aren't wearing masks. The anonymity gives people some kind of permission to be jerks. Anyway, but messaging and using your words appropriately. What about the flip side of that in receiving words in a particular way?
So when, the receiver, and it's a great description. There's a couples therapy model called imago therapy. A book was written by Harville Hendricks called Getting the Love You Want. And he talks about the person who messaged and the person who's the receiver. So what happens if I'm in a conversation with somebody and I don't like what I'm hearing?
Yeah.
I'll talk about it from my vantage point. My heart might race a little. I might sort of be very inclined to be reactive and responsive, and maybe even yes but somebody, or do all those kinds of defensive reactions. What I often say is that when somebody is a receiver and they're uncomfortable with something that's being said, I literally say, I need you to take a time out and stop, because I'm not really hearing what you're trying to say, and the way you're communicating with me, we're about ready to get into war. And I'm probably not going to like losing. So I'm going to keep going until I have And that's what sort of happens.
Yeah.
But if we stop, because we know we're defensive, we actually are communicating to the other person by stop and saying, hey, look, I'm not liking this. We're actually demonstrating the value of being connected, even in discomfort. Not everything I'm going to say is going to be easy for somebody to hear, but I'd like to be able to say it in a way that they can hear it, because the connection is more important to me than me being right. That's what's most important. So that in terms of receiver, that's one of the pieces that I would pay attention to. The other thing, that if it's not uncomfortable, how do people listen? Well, there's two pieces. There's the auditory part of listening, but then there's the listening where I'm listening vis-a-vis, I'm evaluating what you're saying, I'm being critical, I'm judging it, I'm analyzing it. That's not listening. That's being immediately in preparation for this to become a debate, or for me to dismiss what's being said to me. Listening is paying attention to what somebody says to me and noticing inside of myself, how am I receiving this? Oh, I'm getting tense. This is really interesting. I don't like what's being said, or I do like what's being said, and I'm a little uncomfortable because I'm not used to somebody paying me a compliment. Listening is paying attention to what's going on inside of me so that I can respond to the other person, not about so much the content, but how I'm experiencing the content. And at times, taking a look at, can I actually repeat back what the other person says? Or is my head doing a yes, but, or comes some kind of analysis that I miss the message? And so I often say to people, practice listening by self-observation. And can you repeat back what the other person says?
You have just so eloquently put to words like one of the greatest victories I feel like I've ever personally had is when I interrupted my own thoughts listening to Sarah talk to me because I was judging them, I was analyzing them, I was combating them. And I interviewed a gentleman named Ben Harrow. He was a vet, and he used to have to, under fire, get on to a mic and call in, airstrikes. And you're under fire. People are shooting at you. People are trying to kill you. He'd take a breath, tap his foot a couple times, and then to express the message, he had to do it calmly and collectedly, because if he didn't, he might affect the motive of everybody there. And so I'm thinking, if he can do that under fire, we can all do that as husbands or wives, to, take a beat and allow the message to sink in, take a breath, and either take the time out, like you said, or, express yourself from a place that's not defensive, or a place of repeating back whatever the message was and understanding it. That was a huge victory for me, and my communications with my wife are 100 times better. But
it's heartwarming to hear, not only for you and Sarah, but, and then extending the example to this gentleman, Ben. There's a way he, in your example, both yours and in sharing his story, there's a thoughtfulness about it. It's not always easy to message or to receive things that are uncomfortable. But if we could slow down, and this is where the breath work could help, we could slow down and really think about that our words make a difference and how we say it. The amount of tension that could begin to dwindle in relationships would be significant. Some people don't feel like they're at odds with one another.
And being at odds with one another in front of your kids is the wrong thing to do.
Right. And it's hard, because how do you, like for instance, there's a moment, and you know this with kids, you have two young kids, you're having a moment with your spouse, one kid is eating, the other kid's running around, and suddenly you had a moment about a subject that probably needs more than a minute discussion. And yet, the two of you are already, at a 10 in defensiveness. How do you do it? These are where things like having conversations with parents, you literally have to practice the same principles that we practice with our children. Okay, we're going to have to bookmark this and get back to this and do a timeout because now is not the time. Because the baby needs to be fed and the other one's running into the room and I don't want them to get into my toolkit.
Yeah. And actually to continue down that path a little bit, there used to be a time where I'd want to put a pin in a conversation and say, this is not the time or place, let's do it later. But I'm so proud of the way that we're learning to problem solve that I almost want my kids to see us go through the process to say, here's where it was escalated, here's how it got diffused.
Right.
This is something that we're practicing. And this is, we don't hit each other, it's like we talk it out. I feel like we're trying to set a good example. I don't know if that's a good idea or bad idea, or if it's a
great idea. And I think what you're doing is you're modeling, hey, even if they see the tension, they get to see the tension. Maybe not all the data of the discussion, but they could see potentially the tension. Mommy and daddy went and talked, and now we're in a better place. And they can see at least some arc of that process. And that actually is good role modeling for kids. It really is. Congratulations.
Yeah, thank you.
You guys are awesome parents.
I appreciate that. It's always a work in progress. There's never an end point.
And that's the piece, Tyler, I think that most people don't understand. Being a parent is a job for life.
Yeah.
It's a lifetime commitment. And one does not end that job just when their children leave home. There's still an attachment. So it's amazing the amount that the two of you are trying to find a way to model for your kids.
Well, thank you. I'm going to pull something up because I did not print it out, but I'm going to ask you a couple of the same kind of short answer questions that I've asked a lot of guests.
Okay.
And let's see. I know we're gonna get out of here in about 5-10 minutes. So let's say, what is your greatest hope for the children of the world?
Wow, that's a brilliant question. Wow. My greatest hope for the children of the world, that they come up with ways that improve the world, both in terms of using resources for everyone to share, that they utilize their talents and skills as a way that demonstrates the best part of their nature, and that they learn what it means to be a good citizen, not just an individual, but the power of self-awareness is most actualized when we move beyond just our own awareness of self, but our awareness of self in terms of community and being a citizen. So I'd really love for our kids to learn how to be good citizens.
That's beautiful. So that needs to be stenciled on every wall, everywhere. All right, you got a billboard. You're on 95, and it's the Michael Shea billboard with one piece of advice that he can give to parents that are driving by at 90 miles an hour. Has to fit on the billboard. What piece of advice do you give?
Use them words.
Use them words. Love it.
That's going to be our new bumper sticker.
Use them words. That's the name of a book, maybe. Use them words. All right, a gift. Time, money, space, no object at all. You get to give a gift to every parent alive. What gift would you give to every parent?
What a beautiful question. I think the number one gift I would give to parents is the gift of recognizing that parenting is hard work, and an endorsement that it's a growth process along with their children. So I would be a validator, 100% validator. It is work.
Awesome. And let's call this my last question for you, Michael. When in your life do you feel the most love?
Well, I mean, I feel a lot of love right now being with you because you're helping me feel connected, and the fact that you've invited me in. So I think it's moments like this, when I'm with people and we can speak freely, openly, think about ideas, and I find that I feel a connection of love in something bigger than myself. Because I don't have all the answers. And I actually learn most from other people and being in dialogue. So that's where I often feel love the most, is when I'm feeling connected to other people.
Michael Shea, thank you so much.
Tyler, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.